power on.
The following is a presentation of the Sovryn Technica Podcast Feed.
Ooh, the man of tomorrow here for you. And, you know, this is something, I say it every time that I do it. It's such an honor to do podcasts with just a couple of brilliant guys. And of course, that being the guys over at the Agora Podcast, Agora and Penguin. And it's turned into a, I would argue, popular sub-series called Into the Void. This release, and if you're a patron, you're getting it earlier than the public release by a lot. This release is number 6, I believe, in our series, or in our sub-series, and there's no sign of it ever ending. We have a great time talking about all kinds of wild shit, though admittedly, this episode isn't so wild. It does talk controversial stuff, but not in the sense of like the more galactic brain kind of notions that we often get into in Into the Void. But that also lent it much to Penguin had a lot to contribute to the conversation. Of course, Sek always has his, the brilliant stuff he brings in. And the conversation spent a lot of time. There's really 2 subjects that we get into, though the shorter one is at the end, and I imagine we're going to talk about that more in the future. And that has to do with what I coined as the pro-abundance principle. And you're going to have to listen all the way to the end to hear about that. But before you get into the pro-abundance principle, we spend a lot of time responding to a listener question that was sent into the Agora Podcast about a conversation that Sek, Penguin, and I had many moons ago about Israel and the modern state and kind of its not so modern history as well. And we spend a good amount of time covering it here. Now, for clarity's sake, I have appended to this release in the Sovryn Technica Feed, this release of Into the Void, I have appended a section of a Q&A that I did exactly 1 year ago. So we're talking, mid-May 2022, that I had done a Q&A in response to a question about Zionism and Kabbalah, which I think is incredibly appertinent to the conversation that we had on the latest Into the Void. So I am putting that in first. That is kind of going to be my preamble into the conversation, because the one thing that I don't want to have come across is that somehow I am defending the notion of the state of Israel. I am not. And, as you listen to the conversation, I think it makes it clear, but just to, give more context and more history to my thoughts on both the modern state of Israel and, frankly, the ancient nation of Israel. I wanted to include this conversation I had, and actually the Wednesday Q&A, it's number 223. Link is in the show notes if you happen to want to hear the whole thing. And if you're not a patron yet, of course, this will give you an opportunity. But the episode was titled Israel is BS, as in, yes, Israel is bullshit. And it is. And I say that myself as a Jew. So we're going to go right into that, and then that will fold right into the Void number 6. And then, and you can ride that out, that whole conversation around Israel. Then we get into a conversation around pacifism, property, and again, what I've coined and some people have been really excited about this concept, but I'll leave that to you to think about, is the pro-abundance principle. And then, we already have Into the Void number 7 scheduled, and we're going to get nuts on that one. Don't you worry. We'll make sure that one's a good time. Though I know we are going to talk also about I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about the history, some of the history of libertarianism in that one. But it's going to be a great time. Link is in the show notes as well for the Agora Podcast. If you haven't checked that out yet, man, there are just some amazing conversations happening there, and you are going to want to check it out. But I will leave this at that. So we're going to set the Wayback Machine to 1 year ago in May of 2022, and then we'll bring it all right back here to when Sec Penguin and I recently recorded our latest Into the Void, and hopefully the conversation will just meld right in, and you'll hear the little dream harp to let you know when it's changing over. And of course, you'll know just because suddenly you'll be hearing Second Penguin. But phenomenal conversation with phenomenal guys. Always a pleasure. I'll let it all ride out, and I will see all of you on the other side. So, okay, anyway, enough of that. Let's get into the, all right, I want to get to the email, the Judaism question, and then we've got a fun one from the Discord that I will get to here. Okay, so I cut out all the parts of this that turn it into a question here. So I'm editing a little bit on this one. Okay, speaking of a bridge too far, quote, speaking of a bridge too far, which that's referencing an episode I did recently talking about Kabbalah and reincarnation. Let's see. All right. So speaking of a bridge too far, I don't believe you're telling people they should all convert to Judaism, but I could see with your intellectual influence that many might consider that never did before. And then in parens, I'm saying this because, well, I might be, end parens. Okay, I want to stop on that for a second. I don't know how to make this like any more clear. Like, and I appreciate, you don't recognize that, or that's what I'm doing. Like, I am not telling people to become Jews. I am not telling people to convert to Judaism. I am not suggesting anything like that. Okay. In any of the recent conversations that I've had around Kabbalah, questions that listeners have asked, again, I'm talking about what you've asked me about, what you want me to talk about. Okay. I am not coming at you with this stuff. I'm not coming at you like with an agenda of what I think you should do or belief system you should, buy into. And again, even me, like, I am espousing a system, shall we say. I don't like to use the word system, but I am espousing a thought process that is abundantly clear. And like, if there is a central tenet, it is, there is no God. All right. Or there is no sky daddy. There's no sky daddy. So, and if I said that to most other, observant Jews, I mean, they probably, they call me a Parkos and they say, get out of here. Like they'd accuse me of being an Epicurean, which fine. And excommunicate me or something, probably. Maybe, but you get my point. Okay. So I'm really, really not espousing that. If you are intrigued by what I'm talking about, yes, I think in a lot of these texts that we've been talking about, again, there's a lot of truth in them. Okay. That doesn't mean that Jewish texts are the only texts that hold some kind of truth. Like these ancient texts. I mean, I go through to understand, and there's a lot more to this question. I'm going to get to it. I go through life and have gone through life with a premise that our ancestors are a lot smarter than we give them credit for, and in fact could have been. And this does not equate to advanced technology, because intelligence and advanced technology are not mutually, they're not mutually inclusive. That our ancestors, again, were a lot smarter than we give them credit for, and potentially were a lot smarter, perhaps even more advanced, even technologically, but certainly, more intellectually, and ethically and so on, than we are now. So that is a central premise for me. And that premise causes me to look at ancient texts. And I mean, we're talking about a life journey here. This isn't something I started, 6 months ago. Okay. This, and the nice, again, as I said many times, the nice thing about doing a podcast for so long is I can point to all the places where I've already talked about this and where I've already hinted at it. And it's clear once you hear it and once you know. So, I have the fortuitousness to say, No, I'm not espousing something new. This is what I've been saying the whole damn time. This isn't flavor of the month. This is a decade in the making. And actually even longer than that, because like I said, it's my whole life. Like, for example, so, even within like Kabbalah, okay, you're intrigued by Kabbalah. You go pick up the Zohar, like say you grab the Pritzker edition, in English of the Zohar. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. Many volumes. If you're going to buy it, it's expensive. Okay. But you can just go to Z Library and get your hookup. Maybe at some point, if people were interested, I could put together like a package. I mean, because I do have this for myself, like on my Kindle, that I call like my little Hebrew library. And if people were interested in that, like maybe I could share it somehow, with Mega or something through the Discord, or, But anyway, so with Kabbalah, even by Kabbalists, traditional Kabbalists, there are different aspects of Kabbalah. Okay, like there's meditative Kabbalah, there's practical Kabbalah. There are other types of Kabbalah. They're all Kabbalah, and they're all, well, you can argue they're all valid and they can all be implemented and practiced. Okay. Some groups maybe don't argue for, or actually there are many groups that think practical Kabbalah, as in using the knowledge espoused in Kabbalah, for not necessarily for one's own gain, even though that's what they're worried about, but for one's own enrichment. Let's put it that way. That's not necessarily someone's own gain, as in zero-sum game where, okay, I have to have everything and you have to lose everything. That's the concern around using practical Kabbalah. So, I mean, there's people who, argue against practical Kabbalah. Now, practical Kabbalah is not often talked about because it is considered so dangerous. Practical Kabbalah is, of course, a major interest of mine, as well as meditative Kabbalah. All aspects of it are intriguing to me, and I think that there's a lot of truth within it. However, so say you picked up the Zohar, okay, and you start reading it, and you're like, what is this? You start reading, and it's talking about, what is the most beautiful rose in the garden? And it says the assembly of Israel, and it just goes on. But what rose is different than others? It starts a lot of symbolic language. You have all this stuff that, that starts getting discussed, and you're like, well, what the fuck does this mean? And how do I use this? So what do I do with this? Right. And I hear you. I get where you're coming from, especially when you read something like the Zohar. The Zohar is assuming you have excellent knowledge and a wide breadth of knowledge in the Torah, the Tanakh, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, all of it. Okay, it's expecting you to have in a very, very broad knowledge, broad in scope, but also detailed knowledge of Hebrew texts. It's expecting that of you. And the book, most of the books, it's because, again, it's multi-volume. Most of the Zohar is not going to make sense if you don't have that, that initial education. Does that mean you can't take advantage of the practical aspects of what the Zohar talks about, or that you can't glean truths that are within the Zohar, kind of like concepts like the manna machine, right? And things like this? No, you absolutely can. Okay. In fact, that's what Moses Cordovero, who's one of the, if not the best teacher on the Zohar, historically, I mean, he was alive 500 years ago or 600 years ago, but that was his whole point is, okay, you might not understand all this. You might not have that formal education, but you need to start practicing this now because the universe needs to get healed. And we're a part of that, as Kabbalists. Okay. That's his argument. So you can engage in practical Kabbalah, without all of that, massive knowledge. Okay. And again, some of the most respected rabbis in history, would say as much. Now, so why am I talking about this? Because one of the books that I think is one of the most concise and simplest ways of doing, of engaging in a practical application of Kabbalistic principles is not written by a Kabbalist, is not even written by a Jew, as far as I know. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, Charles Handel's not a Jew. And it was written, just maybe about 100 years ago now, actually, now that we're in the 2020s. And that's, of course, the master key system. So, and that's my point, is that you can find, what I consider worthwhile in these Hebrew texts. You can find them elsewhere. It is not exclusive to these Hebrew texts. I do think the Hebrew texts have the most antiquity, systemization, and are a great bellwether to judge any other text by, but it doesn't mean that it's exclusive information. So that's why I'm saying, I am not really arguing that somehow people have to become Jews or whatever, all this stuff. Okay. Like that, that you brought up. So let me reread this question. Okay. The first part of this question, and we'll get into the rest. Speaking of a bridge too far, I don't believe you're telling people they should all convert to Judaism, but I can see with your intellectual influence that many might consider that never did before. I'm saying this because, I might be. So that in mind, as I've wrestled with in my recent research, the quote-unquote land of Israel seems to be a central necessity for Judaism. As an anarchist, as I know you are too, as you say, quote, I can't get behind that, end quote. That being, quote, being the state of Israel. Zionism is very real and a very real problem, even as I'm writing this email with assaults in the West Bank. Yes, that's true. I even read, another journalist from Al Jazeera was killed, due to fire from IDF assaults in the West Bank. So you're absolutely right about that. Without getting emotional, how do you support Judaism but ignore with the necessity, or ignore the necessity of, I think that's what you meant, ignore the necessity of a state of Israel? I mean nothing anti-Semitic by this, and I look forward to your answer. Much love. Okay. First off, there's nothing anti-Semitic in anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic are not the same thing. Okay. I appreciate you clarifying. I didn't take anything in this question for a second. In fact, it seemed quite the opposite, that it was anti-Semitic, in any way. As I hope I just made clear, again, I am not espousing, that everybody become Jews or anything like that. And, really as I've talked about before in other Q&As, Judaism doesn't even, Jews don't even want you necessarily to become Jews unless there's really, some kind of extenuating, circumstances of some kind. And there are already, even if you wanted to buy into Judaism, as in, these Hebrew texts being the reality, and you want to go all the way with it to where you believe in a sky daddy and everything else, there's already rules that exist for Gentiles. You don't have to become, a Jew at all. Like we talked about with the Noahide laws. Also, as we've talked about, and I've tried to make abundantly clear, there is no Judaism. There are Judaisms, and there are a lot of Judaisms, even within what get considered to be the major, what could be called the major three branches, or, three or four, you have Reconstructionism, Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and Orthodox Judaism. Even within each of those, there are a multitude of groups, right? There's modern Orthodox as compared to, Orthodox, or there's Hasidim, right? There's the Hasidic movement within Orthodox, which is totally separate from a lot of other Orthodox Judaism. Within conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism, I mean, there's a bunch of different groups that have what could easily be argued are opposing positions on some very, central points. So that's important to keep in mind. There's even, I've mentioned, the Karaite Judaism. Okay. That was something that 1,000 years ago was actually very popular. And they did not accept the Talmud, the oral Torah in general. They did not accept that. They believed, only the Torah, only the written Torah, and that's it. None of these rabbis, none of that bullshit. That's how they felt about things. You've had other groups who actually ignore the Talmud but they accept the Zohar. So you have again, you have a lot of different ideas. And I mean, and even within rabbinic Judaism in general, even when there was not, like, say, a conservative Judaism or a Reform Judaism or something like that, but still within rabbinic Judaism itself, you had a million, like, Maimonides and Nachmanides argued different points nonstop. You know, I mean, Maimonides' books, believe it or not, like if you study, you know, Judaism, rabbinic Judaism today, like Maimonides is just this towering figure, right? They call him the Great Eagle. He's just this towering figure. But at the time, what would be called Orthodox Jews were burning his books because they thought it was heretical. So, you know, there is no monolithic Judaism for someone to even, like, attach to and to, like, really, really kind of convert to. Okay. Now that actually gets to a point, and that is, okay, but if there's so much disagreement, how did Judaism make it to today, especially when Judaism was never the religion that was in power, right? Christianity carried on because of the Holy Roman Empire, you know, and because of Britain and a lot of other things. Okay. But because it was in power, that's how Christianity has stayed, you know, over throughout the past 2,000 years, because it's, you know, in the Western world anyway, it has been the dominant belief system. Judaism has never been that, like, ever, you know, as far as, you know, since the concept of nation states have been a thing anyway. And this actually gets to kind of my response. So it's important to keep in mind, again, with multiple Judaisms, there are a lot of aspects of Judaism that are anti-Zionist. They do not agree, like a lot of the Hasidic movement, the Haredim, and there are other groups who, I mean, and some might call them fringe, but there are other groups who are Jews, hardcore Jews, Orthodox Jews, okay? You know, they're wearing their whole all black, the whole thing. That think having a state of Israel, certainly right now, is an affront to God. Okay, so not all of Judaism is Zionist. A lot, I mean, and there are arguments that get made for this, you know, within Judaism itself, right? By religious Jews, not just secular Jews. There are a lot of secular Jews who are like Marxists and other things, and they, you know, like they're against states in general, which they're right for the wrong reasons, but okay. But even with religious Jews, so well, you could argue that the Tanakh says that, even though the Tanakh really doesn't, because the Tanakh actually very rarely talks about a Messiah. Really. I mean, I know that would probably shock people, but it's true. But, you know, according to the Tanakh, the people of Israel cannot, or are not to go back, are not to have a state of Israel or the land of Israel until the Messiah comes, which, sorry, Christians, the Messiah hasn't come yet. And even within that concepts of messianism, that's a much larger conversation to get into anyway, because of course Judaism initially taught that there are actually two messiahs, but then you know we get into the works of like Abraham Abulafia, who actually says no, there's no Messiah, but there is a messianic consciousness that you can achieve, and so everybody can become a Messiah, and that's a whole other thing that I'm way more in line with, but that's a whole other conversation to get into. Okay, but it is abundantly clear, and yes, I think Jews, you know, today, and perhaps they are answering for it in that they have such trouble keeping their state, that they're not supposed to return to that land, you know, unless the Messiah has come, which the Messiah has not. Certainly plenty of claim to be, but they're not. Now, so there's that. There's also what's called the three oaths. Okay. So when the Jews were exiled to Babylon, you know, again, 2,500 years ago or so, when the Jews were exiled to Babylon, like part of that exile, there was a pact made between God and the Jews, and God, there's two pacts actually made, the two oaths made between God and the Jews, and then there was an oath made between God and the Gentiles. but they're called the three O's. Okay. Now, people interpret these things in a million different ways, which in Judaism is par for the course. But the idea goes that the Jews will, like they've been exiled to pay for their sins. Okay. And so the Jews are to, well, again, this is all in the Tanakh and the Talmud. The Jews are sworn by God to not forcibly reclaim the land of Israel. So they can't take it by force, but then also they cannot rebel against other nations. Okay. And then the pact, the oath between God and the Gentiles is, you won't subjugate the Jews or, be too nasty, excessively nasty to them when they're in your land. So this is the three O's. Now, I don't know how else to interpret the history of the state of Israel, in the past 70 years. But it smacks of a forceful retaking to me, and that's breaking the three O's. Now, the Gentiles, by this logic, again, I'm not saying I believe the three O's. I'll talk about what I think about all this, but I'm just kind of giving you like a more generalized Jewish perspective. The Gentiles, clearly, with what happened in Nazi Germany, broke their oath with God, right? Did they know about the oath? No, but then ignorance of the law isn't an excuse, right? Oh, kind of, in this case, because talk about excessive subjugation of the Jews, and it's not even funny, but there it is. So now believe me, I've heard this. I've heard other Jews where they would say to me that, yeah, but because the Gentiles broke their oath, we can break ours now. So they're admitting it, that this is going against the three O's, but they're like, yeah, but the Gentiles already broke it. Well, in rabbinic law, there's never really been an argument for, well, just because someone broke a law means I get to. Quite the opposite. A lot of rabbinicism is all about, okay, yeah, but we no matter what happens, we keep the commandments. We keep the 613 mitzvot. We keep going forward because that's what, repairs the universe and blah, blah, and whatever else. So that doesn't fly. That just because the Gentiles broke their oath means that, that the Jews suddenly get to break theirs. That's one of the major arguments for anti-Zionism within Judaism itself. I grant you, it seems like a minority. Anti-Zionism within Judaism seems to be a minority position, but not as much as you would think, especially since the Hasidic movement is really much of the Hasidic movement is really anti-Zionist. Now, let me give you my take, okay, on this. First off, most important point is the land of Israel is bullshit, okay? Now, what do I mean by that it's bullshit? The land of Israel is not the land of the Jews. The land of the Jews is Egypt. That's the ancestral homeland, if you want to call it that. Okay. Now, in Talmud Torah, there are very specific, there's so many things about, that's considered special about the Holy Land. Okay. And again, which is traditionally thought to be Israel. Prophecy can only happen in the Holy Land. The Holy Land is just it's this just really powerful place to be. Now, I'm not going to get into, is Jerusalem an ancient spaceport and all that. I mean, certainly, we could get into some wild conversations on that sort of thing, but that's kind of inconsequential to this. I have argued for a very long time that, even in fact, you can listen years ago, even where the claim is where Solomon's temple was, or where this, or the second temple is inaccurate. The Wailing Wall is, okay, no, actually the temple was over here. And that, again, that's another conversation. But my point being that the state of Israel is a bullshit concept as it exists today, because that's not the ancestral homeland. That's not really the land of promise for the Jews. Okay. Now my argument around that, again, there's a lot of research that I'd have to get into. I've covered some of it in the past on Sovryn Tech episodes, but the work of Ahmed Osman is fantastic. to look into. But again, one of my overall premises is that the Jews are actually Egyptians. Okay, say like it could be, like, for example, King David is actually Tutmos III. Okay, it got reinterpreted. So if all of that about the Holy Land is reinterpreted, then the concept of the land of Israel is off base, like, and it's off the mark. So whether or not there's some like special geography, on planet Earth, I mean, here's the funny thing, right? Is everybody's like, well, what's the big deal about the land of Israel, about Israel, about that area? What's the big deal about Palestine? Who gives a shit? Live somewhere else, right? One of the few places on Earth that I feel like most people would say, oh, no, that land is something special. One of the few places on Earth that I think most people would agree on that is Egypt itself, particularly, say, around the pyramids, where they'd be like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, whatever. This land doesn't matter. This land doesn't matter. Oh, but that land, something special will happen there. Something special is there. And that's because it is, and we don't have to get into the work of Robert Bauval. I mean, we could talk, again, this is such a big subject, but I'm just trying to explain to you that how do I square away like any credence that I give Judaism with Zionism? Well, I think Zionism is completely based upon false premises, false geography, a lot of falsehoods. So, and I'm not the only one. I'm not like making this up. There are many, professionals in their fields who, not people on Ancient Aliens, actual people who, have gone through the blood, sweat, and tears, who should get the respect of their peers. Maybe they don't, but they have the credentials regardless. Okay. And if those matter to you, there they are, that are making the points that I'm making right now. And I've certainly benefited greatly from their research. So there's that. The other part. Okay. Now, if I was to argue from a more, shall I say, spiritual standpoint, or even from like, giving the Jews some kind of like chosen people status or something like that. If I were to argue from that standpoint, I think that Jews wanting a nation state identity eliminates their peculiarity. What makes Jews special disappears. I mean, and it disappears when you start playing into petty politics, right? And that's exactly what the state of Israel is. I mean, you could say, oh, this is life or death struggle. Sure, I hear you, but it's playing into very petty politics. Because if Judaism at the same time accepts something like the Zohar and the idea that what the Jews do has what they do and what they practice, and they're practicing the mitzvah and everything, has ramifications to the very fabric of reality, then, worrying about being recognized by the UN or being taken seriously by other countries and all this stuff is, I mean, talk about bullshit. Like, that's thinking so small in comparison to what you are supposedly charged with, as the quote unquote chosen people. And there's precedent for this, even though I think a lot of the history is rewritten history that exists within the Tanakh. You look at like what happened with Samuel. The prophet Samuel is telling the Israelites at the time, they're begging for a king. Why? Because they want to be like other nations. And Samuel's saying, you don't want this. You don't understand. The other nations don't have it figured out. This is not a good idea. You don't want a king. But it caves in anyway, and God kind of caves in anyway, right? Again, buying into it, through a traditional Jewish perspective. There, like this idea of, the Jews having a president or a king or having like a nation state and all that, okay. So this is something that gets into like rabbinic commentary and like Talmudic commentary. Like the idea of animal sacrifices, right? Now, when you research this, it's only something you can do when you actually have the temple. Of course, Jews don't have the temple right now, so they're not engaged in animal sacrifices, and they've replaced it with concepts like teshuvah and others. So you can read even from, rabbis like, and I'm talking like Maimonides and others, where they talk about that, okay, animal sacrifices, yep, they're what we're to do when there's a temple, but ultimately animal sacrifice was a concession, it wasn't a concession to God, it was a concession to the human psyche. As in, humans at the time just weren't at the point where they could understand, like what God actually wanted. And so he created this, the argument would go that God, the Sky Daddy, created this concept of animal sacrifice to give God what he wanted out of the Israelites. So it's a concession made. It's like prayer. Like, why do you need to pray? If God is omniscient and omnipresent, why doesn't he just know everything? Well, traditionally, under a traditionalist view, he does. Again, prayer is not for God. Prayer is for your psyche to be able to interact with the larger forces of the universe. You see. So someone who, like people who kind of evolve spiritually, mentally, whatever, would get beyond, and in this case, the Jews, should get beyond the idea of a nation state, the idea of a king, there's lots of things that they should get beyond. They should get beyond animal sacrifices, which they have, which is interesting because where does the concept that replaced animal sacrifice, which is teshuvah, where did that come from? The rabbis pulled it from the patriarchs. The rabbis pulled it from before there, were the tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's where they got that concept from. So closer to perfection, right? The time of Adam, teshuvah is the idea. Animal sacrifice is not. Now I know Cain and Abel engaged in sacrifice and all that. Again, that is another subject for another time. But in the abstract, the point being made here is that the Jews should get beyond the concept of, like petty real estate and petty politics. If they were existing in a closer spiritual state to what, depending upon your viewpoint, whether it's more conventional or not, to what Sky Daddy wanted or what the Ein Sof wanted or the infinite was, or interacting with the infinite, actually requires. But it's ultimately a shame. It's actually, it's kind of sad that, every time that the Jews historically try to fit in with the cultures around them, I think something is lost. Like they should, and I'm speaking as one, like I enjoy being a peculiar person. I think Jews should enjoy being a peculiar people that don't fit in. And, if I were to buy into the idea that they're the chosen people, that Jews are the chosen people and the light unto the nations, then be the light, because the world is fucking darkness. Be the fucking light. Don't be like the rest of the world. And having a state of Israel, having a state, is just being like the rest of the fucking world. How boring and pathetic. Be more. Be beyond that. So, yeah, I don't square away. Like the state of Israel to me, like even within, what I could interpret as, my belief systems within Kabbalah and other things, the state of Israel is anathema. It's wrong, as in A, it's even the wrong geography. It's in the wrong location. But B, it's also anathema in concept. So I hope that answered your question.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Into the Void with Brian Sovryn, our recurring show within a show, featuring the aforementioned Dr. Brian Sovryn. It's me, Penguin, with Sec Agora here, coming at you live with it actually is live for now. We do broadcast our shows live as we record them, and you are free to join. If you are a patron, join us at our Patreon that you can get a link to. But coming at you live with Into the Void number 6, which is actually our 7th episode with Dr. Brian Sovryn. We got episode 0 in there. Brian, how you doing?
Doing well. Yeah, episode 6. I think maybe after episode 7, when we get to episode 8, we'll have beat the average podcast. So for a podcast within a podcast, we could probably stop counting at that point. But I like that this is episode 6. It's also fitting because I just saw Return of the Jedi last night. So yeah, which happens to be episode 6 of Star Wars. But we're not here to talk about Star Wars. We're here to get nuts, and I know we'll do it. So anyways, Sec, how the hell are you, man?
I'm doing all right, man. It's it's springtime, so I'm busy as shit with the business and the homestead, and we are just a little kind of announcement just because we were just talking about it, and I'm kind of excited. We own another 6 acres like 30 minutes north of us that's just woods, and we just made the decision that we're gonna clear that and put a bunch of livestock on it. So that's gonna be a whole lot of more work over the next couple of years, but it's gonna be cool because we can do it. We're gonna do it totally off grid, the whole 9 yards, and make it as sort of closed system and self-sufficient as possible. So I'm pretty stoked about that.
Man, you're running your own little kibbutz down there? Is that what's going on?
That's what I'm building. It's the Empire of Sekistan. So I'm expanding my territory. But no, yeah, I'm pretty stoked about that.
Medieval. It's very medieval. What? You got a little territory here, a little territory there. You're making it work.
Little fiefdoms. Yeah.
One king's cattle, one king's deer at a time. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, no, that's what I've been doing amongst everything else. So I've been busy as shit, working 7 days a week again. So
yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, business is booming. I gotta say, we had an early break in spring. I know you would have noticed that just as much as I did. And yeah, we've got a long backlog at work. So I gotta say, happy about that. Really taking over in my noticeably more urban setting. Just plenty of growing over here.
So little recap, because we're going to go into a response to a previous episode, but a couple episodes prior, we talked about what is known as the Jewish question, and sort of the history of anti-Semitism, and I think we got into the relationship between like sort of Jews and capitalism and stuff like that. So and I'm sorry, I couldn't find the question, and I tried to scroll back and I couldn't.
I do have it if you want.
You got it handy?
Yeah, I pulled it up.
Man, you are way better at this than I am.
Might have been doing this for a decade, but
I tried to find it. I couldn't find it.
No worries. Yeah, I can read it if you want, or if you just want to, go with the overview. It's up to you.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. That was
sure.
That's what this question or response is in response to, was our previous episode on Jewish folks.
Yeah, which I love that we're getting feedback into a sub-series. I mean, in my opinion, that almost never happens. So I dig it when it does. So here it is. You had shared this with me. Actually, you shared this with me on February 8th of 2023. So that's how long we've been thinking about this whole thing. That long. No, we really haven't. But we've been planning to talk about it for that long anyway. But here we go. Quote, guys, been meaning to message about this episode. I agree there's a lot of unfair narrative around Jewish people, i.e. misattributed deeds. It would seem to me a lot of modern vitriol against Jews is really rooted in disgust of actions taken by the Israeli state. I'm not sure you touched on this. In my own mind, I recognize the outrageous crimes of the U.S. state, but I also see what Israel has done and may have done, and it somehow stands alone in its egregiousness, what they seemingly, quote, get away with, end quote, and their undue influence over the U.S. state. Thoughts, ? End quote. There it is.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think there is something to say with that, what we don't see today is not every suspicion of Jewish people, Jewish individuals and influence and society stuff is necessarily indirect, descent from historical and like medieval, or post-medieval narratives of, quote unquote anti-Semitism or various opinions on Jews or groups of Jews or whatever. So I think maybe especially after a lot of those ideas became very taboo after the events of the early 40s, I think the 1940s. I think that I can certainly say that without the founding of the State of Israel and the subsequent decades, that we and I guess American politics as well. I guess you can't leave out the American politics part of this, is uniquely tied to both Jews around the world and the State of Israel in particular. I think you would see a very much less quote unquote anti-Semitism or strong opinions on the Jews without that. And a lot of that's due to the fact that the United States has a very large Jewish population in comparison even to the State of Israel. I mean, it has much more Jews. I believe the state of New York has more Jews living in it than the State of Israel. So, I mean, it's a very heavily Jewish country, even if they represent out of a total of a fairly small percentage. And of course, the United States being the global hegemonic superpower with a lot of Jewish individuals and a close ties with the State of Israel. I think that without any of that, any of the post 1945 and 1948 history, so to speak, I don't think you would see a direct connection, a direct thread between any sort of historical pre-World War II anti-Semitism and or narratives about the Jews and today. Certainly that's kept it alive because a lot has happened since that period of time.
Yeah, Zach, do you have anything you want to respond on that?
I would just say that I don't think the State of Israel is responsible for all anti-Semitism, but I think a lot of Zionists have done Jewish folks a disservice by conflating any criticism of the State of Israel with actual anti-Semitism. And I think what makes Israel stand out in modern times is it acts very much like a colonial power, like straight out of like the colonial period, when we're living in sort of a neo-colonial or post-colonial world in some sense. So it's like very much like like 17th century colonialism in a modern state. And yes, the United States is guilty of much worse crimes over the years and over the centuries and such, but you're seeing much more atrocities come out of the State of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians in modern times, when it's this is sort of colonialism is sort of frowned upon these days. So I think that's what makes Israel stand out as particularly egregious among modern nation states. And I could be wrong. It just could be, it could be just, on par or average in comparison.
Well, even within the scope of colonialism, I mean, it's also an ethno state, which is pretty, it stands out as an ethno state in a way, a very negatively an ethno state in a way that's really not terribly comparable with any other state, and especially in current times or at all in history, in fact.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of parallels drawn between like apartheid South Africa and the current state of things in Israel. So yeah, I think you are correct there. In a time where this is not accepted, so I think that's where I don't think this is the root of all anti-Semitism currently. I don't think that's the case at all. I think even if the State of Israel didn't exist, you'd still have people in the United States with weird Jewish conspiracies and that sort of thing, just because of, I mean, Jews live here too, so it's right. It's been an easy other. I think the state of Israel is certainly, and there's been a lot of Jews that have made this point, that it has done more. The state of Israel has done more to stoke anti-Semitism than anything else in recent history. But
sure.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I imagine anybody listening to this knows, but of course I am an Ashkenazi Jew. It's important to kind of to preface that, because something I'll discuss is the concept of what is called Ashken normativity, which is, well, I guess where I want to start on a lot of this is, so it is an ethno state. Israel is an incredibly complex government in comparison to many other governments for a multitude of reasons. One of the things that makes it so complex is, and I do want to touch on some of the history of Zionism. A lot of this we covered in the previous Into the Void, but I'll hit on it as well. So it was in 2022, there was the big deal around, well, Netanyahu ends up getting back in power in December, and he wants to effectively disempower the Supreme Court in Israel. There was some condemnation to come out of the Biden administration, a whole bunch of other nonsense and whatever, and he's backpedaled on it because within the country, Israelis, both Arab Israeli as well as, more, I guess Jewish Israeli and natural Israeli are, had a real problem with this. So the reason that this was such a, outside of it being, okay, is Israel a democracy? What is a democracy without a Supreme Court, without this, check and balances of powers? Outside of that, the odd part is, so we have a quote unquote republic, really, but we like I don't even like to use we, but in the United States claims to be a democratic nation, and it has a Supreme Court. The checks and balances work in the United States a little bit differently, though, because there is a mainline document that everything gets held up against, and that being the United States Constitution. Now, the Israeli government doesn't really have a constitution. They may have some degree of documentation that they will appeal to, but really all they have are these very basic laws that you could almost put in quotes when you talk about them. And there are a lot of things that were questions at the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. And that includes how important is, the Torah, how important is religious law, biblical law, to the government, and amongst even where exactly is the border of the State of Israel. Like there are a lot of questions that, frankly, in 75 years, and this year it is 75 years, with the Hebrew calendar, they would have celebrated it on April 25th, the 75th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel. By the normal calendar, the Gregorian calendar, I guess it'd be May 14th that would, so this is 75 years where there are foundational questions of what makes the State of Israel what it is that have never been answered. And I bring that up to say that, this isn't a country that has a lot of hard and fast rules. It actually doesn't. And it also, while it tries to copy what at the time was these grander concepts of European nationalism, while it's a country that tries to copy that, it never really did. And it also had an issue where really you had two different, one of the major concerns that people will bring up is this idea of Zionism. And that's without even getting into necessarily a conspiratorial Jews rule the world kind of bent, because Zionism was a genuine movement. But there's really not a Zionism. There are Zionisms, and there are many. In fact, at the founding of Israel, there's really an ideological battle around two different types of Zionism. Now, the one that actually won, which ended up with the first prime minister of David Ben-Gurion, was a socialist Zionism. And that's really important to keep in mind. That, in fact, I made the joke about starting a kibbutz down there. That was an attempt at a segue, because the people who ran the kibbutzes in Israel ended up like winning the day and becoming, basically the government. But you go from the late 1940s until you get to the 1970s, and by the 1970s, those socialistic ideals that were being held, met the realities of capitalism, both the advantages and disadvantages of that, and it would fall very much away from being that socialistic nation. And so, I think a lot of people forget that this is not. That initially Israel was not some kind of democratic bastion, or it was in the sense, that yes, you could vote, but it wasn't like this home of capitalism whatsoever. It was a very idealistic and socialistic country for, at least the first half of its existence or so. And that would eventually change. Now, what's happening in Israel, that everybody was freaking out about with the Supreme Court getting knocked out of the way. See, the Supreme Court really is what holds a lot of the power in Israel. And that's because of there isn't that constitution. There's just these very loose laws, and the Supreme Court, however many people hold however many chairs within it, that Supreme Court gets to really interpret those laws. And in some ways, it's the most powerful position in there. So that's why Netanyahu wants to kick that out, and start solidifying a lot of laws. So the funny thing is, and this speaks to, I'm again, part of the reason I'm starting with this is it speaks to the question that, okay, yeah, there's religious or, Jews that we think of more in a religious sense, and they get, perhaps irrationally attributed and lumped in with what the state of Israel does. It's a confusing thing because really the state of Israel does not, yes, it is an ethno state, I guess in some ways similar to, say, Japan or something along those lines. That's true. But the religious aspects have never been codified. Now, they often get favored, sure, just because of who's in charge. But they've never really been codified. And actually, it's not until the past year that has really become a reality where, wow, you know what? Levitical law could become government mandate in Israel. And the interesting thing to happen out of that, and you can get this right from from foreign ministers' mouths, in Israel. There's a famous saying where they'll talk about American Jews, and they'll say, well, yeah, American Jews, they used to be like brothers, now they're like cousins. Now, why would the foreign minister for Israel say such a thing? He's saying that because American Jews don't even like what the state of Israel is doing, particularly as late with what Netanyahu has in mind.
Not at all.
Right. So this association between Jews and the state of Israel, like, it doesn't fly, because in America, which you're totally right, Penguin, for bringing up. I'm from New York as well. There's so many Jews in New York. Half the towns in New York, we all have joking names for them. Like I came from I'm originally from New York City, but I lived many years in a town called Utica. We called it Judica because there's just so many fucking Jews there, and I say that as one of them. But there's such a large population of Jews here, and most of them do not agree with the actions of the state of Israel. They might appreciate that there's some kind of home for Jews to go to. And yes, anybody who has, who's ethnically Jewish can apply for what's called the law of Aliyah, which is the law of return. And so you can get instant citizenship. Like I could do this. I could get instant citizenship, for Israel if they want to. And they might appreciate that exists. But let me assure you, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can go to the mainstream news. Most Jews in this country are not happy about, how Israel handles business. Certainly, at least in recent years. Now, we could get into conspiracies around what Israel has done, since its founding. And there are certainly some ugly parts to that story. And there's other aspects I think that are worth talking about, because there is just like there's no monolithic Zionism, which I think is important to touch on. There's also no monolithic Judaism. And that leads to some very, very nasty business of what is effectively anti-Semitism within Semitism. Between Ashkenazis and Sephardic. And anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, let me respond to that. Basically, going back to what I said before. And to clarify, we are seeing a massive shift. And the reason we're seeing a massive shift in the state of Israel, the culture, the political culture, everything that's going on over there, big shift, and everybody's that's commenting on that part of the world or whatever is pointing that out. And yes, now we're seeing a break because we've seen the state of Israel having existed long enough that they've created an entirely separate. They've created their own politics and their own concept of nationality and even ethnicity, but their own concept of nationality that is diverged greatly and is rapidly diverging from like the past and from Jews in other parts of the world. That's very true, very clear. But there's also the intervening, the intervening first 70 years, I think, where there were very close ties between obviously between the Jewish, the Jewish population and the institutions of this country that have that Jews have over those decades really climbed the ranks, especially in those decades, somewhat before World War II, I guess, but I think very much after World War II, when we really started seeing a lot of Jewish names throughout American institutions, business, government, and everything, because a lot of them came over previously as dirt poor immigrants, and so there's a very strong base of Jewish people in this country, and that would have supported the state of Israel. And likewise, there's always that very real concept of the Jewish or the Zionist lobby. There was a lot of back and forth for like 70 years. And now, just now, like you said, very, very recently, we're seeing a strong shift. I mean, Netanyahu's been around for a long time, and there was the Netanyahu and the being very close with the American Christian right and the George W. Bush style neocons and everything. Well, guess what? Those factions have both kind of gone by the wayside in American politics. They no longer need to be sort of a little brother to America or anything like that. That's the past. We're in a new era, and they're very much on their own. They're very much, have a complex diplomacy with the a increasingly multipolar world and increasingly multipolar diplomacy, and they've really at this point have shown that they have created an entirely self-sustaining new nationality, and there's a lot of I'm sure there's a lot of ideological diversity within Israel, and actually there's very complicated politics, as you mentioned, but there's also even if you want to draw a line in things are rapidly shifting in the 2020s. There's the intervening period between 48. I get India, Pakistan confused with Israel, but I think it's 48. The intervening time between 48 and say 2016, let's just say, and onwards with Trump and the Abraham Accords and the whole thing about the open cooperation with the Gulf states and a lot of that has something to do with it too. We're in a completely new era of Israeli history, but there's also that intervening 70 or 80 or so years there was a very complex relationship between essentially a strong base of a Jewish population in the United States that numerically was larger than the Israeli population, and I think still is, and the state of Israel. And there was just a lot of back and forth and a lot of connections, a lot of political connections, and Israel likewise is a very important part of American politics for various reasons. I mean, there's the Cold War, there's the post-Cold War, there's the neoconservatives, there's a lot going on there for sure.
Yeah. I think another point that gets because I kind of got the sense from the question that the listener asked, it seems like Israel always gets a pass. And it's certainly from America, right, which is the superpower. I don't know that that's always been true. I mean, for one thing, there's got to be, and some of this we talked about in the previous episode. For example, one of these solutions, okay, during World War II, what do we do with the Jews? In fact, I mean, many of them were turned away when they got to the United States to escape from Nazi Germany. But beyond that, okay, well, we got some here. What are we going to do? Or what do we do with Jews around the world? How are we going to keep, the Holocaust from happening again? Things like this. And, at the time, FDR had ideas from Arizona to Oregon to put, to just turn into like kind of a weird quasi-Jewish state. But he didn't want to deal with it. And you can read his own letters. He did not want to have to be involved in any kind of problem solving for the Jews ultimately. And honestly, his language is, would easily today get labeled as anti-Semitic. Same with, who was in charge of the U.S. when the Israeli state was getting created in 1948. It was, we had Harry Truman. Harry Truman was refusing to talk to, anybody about Zionism. He was refusing to talk about this, creating a Jewish state. He basically had to have a lifelong friend who he fought in a war with, who happened to be Jewish, but was like from Missouri, Jacobson was his name. Jacobson had to come in and say, look, I'm asking you for a personal favor. I want you to talk to this guy who is, a key to setting up, a Jewish state in the Middle East. And that's finally what did it. But it took that kind of personal favor. Otherwise, Truman was like, I'm not answering any calls. I'm not dealing with this problem. I am not interested. So the idea that the United States has somehow always been chummy with this idea of the state of Israel, no way. The history shows the exact opposite. Also, the other thing we could bring up, and this is an example that I bring up often, is the character of Jonathan Pollard, who Jonathan Pollard was a spy for Mossad. He was a spy for Israel in the United States. He got locked up in the 80s, and he stayed locked up until 2020. If somehow, we're, the United States and Israel, they're just the best of goddamn friends. Why would an agent of Mossad be locked up for 40 years? These are things that don't make sense. I know a lot of people want to bring up, talk about egregious things that the state of Israel does. What about the USS Liberty, right? Everybody wants to bring that
I'm about
up.
to say it.
Yeah. So, this is coming out of the 6 Days War, right? So this is in the late 60s, starting in 67, it was in 67. It was, again, the length of the war is in the name. But, the U.S. Liberty or USS Liberty, everybody talks about this, here it is. Israel, attacks this, quote unquote friendly, U.S. naval vessel and kills some odd 32, 36 people, however many it was. And they don't have to do anything. Israel they don't even really get a slap on the wrist. Sure, they pay some reparations to the families of the people that died as an apology, but they don't even get a slap on the wrist for this. And so people are like, well, that's because Israel actually rules the world. Israel's the bad guy that gets away with everything because they're really in charge somehow or whatever. There's a lot of different theories as to what actually ended up happening with the USS Liberty incident, because what we do know, and there is what you would qualify as incontrovertible footage of IAF, Israeli Air Force, jets, attacking a U.S. naval vessel. And that did happen. I've always felt that the response that makes the most sense. There's a Russian author. He wrote a book called The History of Mossad. And what he said in that was the Soviets were assisting Egypt, right? Because the 6 Day War is between Egypt and Israel. The Soviets were assisting Egypt, and the Soviets were spying on any radio chatter that the Americans were picking up and sending back out. Okay. And so Israel effectively, they knew that this was going on. And first off, and again, I'm not, yes, I'm Jewish. I am completely against the notion of the state of Israel, just to be abundantly clear, and just in case somebody thinks I'm playing apologetics here or something. I'm not. I'm just saying there is a reality to all of this. There is a very twisted state-minded logic, which I even hate to think about, but here it is. But I think, I agree with this author on the history of Mossad, that what ended up happening was, or what I was going to say, the USS Liberty itself was a spy ship. It's not like it was all hunky-dory. Oh, we're just innocent people out here. No, it's actually on a surveillance mission. It is a spy vessel. It even there was an adjoining submarine nearby that couldn't do anything to help it when the Liberty incident happened. But it's not like they were all hunky-dory or anything. They're literally engaged in subterfuge. So with this incident, the Israelis knowing, or the Israeli government knowing that, well, so, okay, I'm trying to like bake in the history quick, because you had where there was a ceasefire that was being signed between Egypt and Israel. But Israel planned the instant that they could get past the ceasefire, they were going to start attacking the Golan Heights. But they couldn't let anybody know that attack on the Golan Heights was going to happen. But the USS Liberty would have picked up that it was going to occur, and thus the Russians would have found out. And then the Russians would have told the Egyptians about the attack on Golan Heights.
The Syrians.
And so, yeah, Syrians, right? Yes. And so, so what ends up happening is they're like, well, we've got to take out the spy vessel, because otherwise they're going to know what we're doing. They're going to know about our surprise attack on Golan Heights. Now, I'm not saying that's the best answer in the world, and there's a lot of different, again, there's a lot of different theories as to what exactly happened there, but I do think that's the one that makes the most sense and has the most twisted logic behind it. But again, that's another case, regardless of how you look at that, that's another case where, okay, this idea that somehow the US and Israel are like the best of friends. Oh, no. Israel will do what it wants, when it needs to, or when it feels it needs to. Go ahead.
We can't separate this history from the history of the Cold War. I mean,
right.
A lot of the support, I think a lot of the strong support began in the Eisenhower administration, but with the like you're just mentioning the 6-Day War, that's all intertwined with Cold War politics. And
totally.
Yeah, and so again, another country, the Republic of China, Taiwan, the Republic of China, the Chinese nationalists, they had also a huge lobby in the United States too. And without even having this massive Jewish population and this massive Jewish lobby in the United States lobbying the U.S. government for supporting the state of Israel, I'm sure there was some Chinese nationalists lobbying the U.S. government. They were very close with certain aspects of, I think, the right or whatever. But there was a huge part of like American Asian policy and China policy was driven by the Chinese nationalists in the Republic of China. So Taiwan, we call Taiwan now, but the Republic of China had a huge impact and a huge lobby in the United States government at the same time, and they got a lot. I mean, they never got that official recognition or whatever from the United States, but they got F-86 Sabre jets and U.S. training and all that stuff, and the entire Korean War and post-Korean War Korea policy and all that stuff. From what I understand, the Korean War itself was very largely driven by China policy and on the Republic of China and their People's Republic of China, Chinese communists. And the reason that war was prosecuted the way it was, and all the carpet bombing and the massive military conflict on the Korean Peninsula was largely driven by the greater policy of containing China and kind of on behalf of a whole decades of policy on behalf of the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan, in the same way that so much policy for the U.S. in the Middle East was based on that one country, that little country, the state of Israel.
Zach, what do you got?
I would just say that I've also heard the theory that Israel had been committing atrocities, and they realized that the Liberty was aware of this and couldn't allow that information to escape. And as far as like them not having any repercussions, I think the Cold War narrative is the correct assessment of this. Like,
right.
So LBJ was really like one of the first presidents to like wholeheartedly support Israel. And it was at a time where, like, I think the U.S., it was, we're talking the height of the Cold War, really. And I think the U.S. thought it needed any possible friends it could get, So if the Soviets are supporting Egypt, you're obviously the U.S. is going to support the other side, right?
Right.
So I think there's not much more to that than that. Now, since then, they've the Zionists have certainly have a decent what do you call it, a lobbying in the United States, but I think that's been waning in past decades.
Oh yeah.
In past years for sure.
Yeah. And like any support, from what little because I try not to pay too much attention to politics, but from what little I do glean, support from the Democratic Party in the United States has waned significantly towards Israel. I mean, the Republicans always are doing what they're doing, but there was a time where there was fairly, unanimous support within the Democrat Party as well for Israel, and that's no longer really a thing. And a lot of that has to do with Netanyahu, which, I mean, this happens. Again, that 75-year history, Netanyahu's been in charge for about a fifth of that. That's incredible and I don't mean that in a good way, but that's incredible for anyone to achieve within the lifetime of a country. But yeah, I mean, this is with Zionism, even this, the guy who really pushed and coined the term, but really pushed for and started the movement of Zionism, that was Theodor Herzl. And his original idea was, we'll get a plot of land in East Africa. That's what he called for. He wasn't even saying to go to the state of Israel. So, that's why it's really important to bring up, like, okay, we hear you. There's these conspiracies. There's these concerns. Why does Israel get to be so egregious? Blah, 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 blah. So, well, understand that, this idea that it has to be Israel, that's not even an original concept within Zionism. And there's not just one Zionism, there are Zionisms. There are so many different ideas around, or so many different potential implementations of an idea of Zionism, of a Jewish homeland, that again, originally didn't even include the state of Israel. What do you guys got?
So I want you to critique what I'm about to... go ahead, Zach.
So a lot of my knowledge of the history of Zionism comes from listening to Sheldon Richman, who's pretty great on this subject, and he draws a lot from he's also a former, or he's a Jewish fellow, no longer religious.
No.
No, he's a non-religious Jew. He's not no longer religious, and he grew up a Zionist as well, and he's done a lot of research into this, and he draws a lot from Jews and rabbis who are anti-Zionist, damn it, I can't think of the one fellow, but there's the other guy, Shlomo Sands, who's done a lot of writing on this, on the history of Zionism. And originally, Zionism, it was not a religious movement, believe it or not. A lot of and again, I'm going from what I've heard from Sheldon Richman here, but a lot of them were very secular.
Yes.
And they themselves ascribe to a lot of what you would sort of attribute anti-Semites saying now, like these people are subversive. Jewish folks are subversive force in any country that they would possibly live in. So we need to make them their own homeland. All of these sorts of things, like very pretty egregiously anti-Semitic. A lot of these Jewish conspiracy tropes. You would not know the difference between the early Zionists and your average believer in Zog or whatever the thing, right?
Sure.
And at the time, and this is just, again, my understanding sort of secondhand, is most Jews were not on board. For the way I've heard it put is like the Reform Jews, because, there's lots of different Judaisms. Mm-hmm. The Reform Jews were like, we don't need a homeland. We have New York.
Right.
And the Orthodox are like, who are you to tell us to go home? You're not the Messiah. You know what I mean? So it was really like, and those were the two main schools of Judaism. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but those were the two main, schools of Judaism at the time. And both of them were very much against Zionism. And you'll still find a lot of Jews that are either, if not against Zionism entirely, but very critical of the state of Israel. It was not until the rise of Nazi Germany that a lot of Jewish folks got on board with the project for,
correct,
obvious reasons, right? But I think, like we've all said before here in this conversation, I think even support among Jews for the state of Israel is waning, especially in America, because they sort of have these, somewhat liberal values of human rights and, civil rights and those sorts of things. And for, people to be treated poorly based on their ethnicity in the what's called Greater Israel is an affront to like their ideals, even as Jews. So I don't see again, I will repeat that I don't see the state of Israel being the source of all anti-Semitism, but I also think that many Zionists are guilty of trying to make that so.
Sure.
For the reasons I said before, conflating any, making, basically making the government of Israel the government for all Jews in the world, and is how they sort of present that. And then also any criticism of the state of Israel, you are immediately criticizing Jewishness itself, which is not true either. And to conflate those two is to, I think, further the rise of anti-Semitism. In some sense.
Well, it's the problem of having something that kind of comes off as an ethno-religious state, and I think the history is a little more complicated whether it really has been that. But when some people feel it advantageous to like present it as that, that's what you get. And Jews do have as a religious group. It's uniquely a ethno-religious group, and so on and so forth, where like they do have a connection with the state of Israel in a way that's different than other groups. But yeah, I mean, it's also important to realize that in the past decade, even a period where there's just been sharp differences smaller than a decade. Well, it doesn't say in the past decade, because it's also been a long time coming. I think the state of Israel has existed for the better part of a century, and it's something that has developed its own strong nationality and identity outside of that, and it's moving on to a new thing, and that new thing is more aggressively, ethnocentric, and it's moving into a different thing. We're moving into a new era of this thing. But like I said in the past, there is that whole Jewish lobby, AIPAC kind of whole connection, and I do think that has kept a certain kind of anti-Semitic, if you want to call it that, like ideas alive over time, and that's where like you would have seen these views become much more marginal after the war had it not been for the state of Israel. And that's just like a fact that doesn't really lend any credence to any specific views that yes, some people in the margins would have these kind of views about Jewish people, but without there being a Jewish state and a Jewish lobby and everything, then those views would continue to be marginal, actually, and way more taboo than they would have been before the war, obviously. But I also I think it's important to point out that things aren't monocausal. I don't know how much involvement there was between some factions within the United States establishment of government or whatever, or the Jews or the CIA and the Dulles brothers. I don't know who might have had in the 1945 to 47 period. I really don't know. I know a lot of stuff was going on that was very much homegrown within like Palestine, but this is a very chaotic world in the immediate couple years after World War II. So it's probably a really fascinating history if you read a book about it, but I certainly have not. But I think that once the state of Israel is founded, and once it gets attacked by all the Arab states, and then all those Arab states, military detachments and armies and everything gets defeated, and the Palestinians get driven out and into refugee camps, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. The story. I think once that happens and the Jewish state is founded, and then it survives for a certain number of time within the Cold War context, that wholly guiding, like the Cold War thing that's wholly guiding the United States, the state, the American state, that's this bipartisan kind of anti-communism global, for lack of a better term, right-wing world order, the United States half of the Cold War paradigm. I think once that state exists, and not that the other Arab states or whatever like immediately go to the Soviet Union, and then as a reaction, the United States has no choice. But within that whole concept of we mentioned it before, a group of Arab states that want to be in solidarity, want to unite, and having this thing right in the middle between them, that you can't have a united Arab Republic of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, because if you know the history, like in '56, the United Arab Egypt and Syria tried to be united, even though they don't. They basically got a sea and Israel in between them, and so forth. I think it became very useful and very instrumental for these really strong factions of the United States government, the Democratic anti-communists, which the Democratic Party was fanatically anti-communist, like the Kennedys and such, and they're conservative Republicans, the faction, one of the three legs of that right-wing school of the new right, the right-wing stool, of the new right, the anti-communist, hawk, the right-wing international war hawk. I think that bipartisan consensus that was driving the whole Cold War period, obviously saw Israel, if they're going to stick around. I don't think a lot of people would have thought they could have pulled it off, but once they did, it became, a very important part of, I think, U.S. global policy.
Sure. Yeah. And I stand by that. We talked about that in the previous episode, the idea that, one of the primary reasons, not the only, but one of the primary reasons I think the state of Israel even exists and gets tolerated by, much of the world, not necessarily, Arab nations, but by much of the world, is that it is a stick in the mud to keep a new Ottoman Empire from rising, or, united, Arab, some kind of united Arab nations. I fully believe that's a major reason.
Hey, listen.
Yeah.
At the mosque, I'm around. Look, there's a lot of ethnicities. There's every Muslim ethnicity you can imagine, for the most part. There's a lot of ones that are barely represented, but the Arabs, which is an ethnicity totally based on nothing but the commonality of the Arab language. But Arab people, when they get together, they love talking in their Arabic, and they might be from Morocco, and the other one might be from Syria, and the other one might be from Sudan. But they do have a common bond, and I will tell you that doesn't necessarily mean that Moroccans and Libyans and Egyptians and Sudanese and so forth and Iraqis all want to be in one political union. But I think that a lot of them on the grassroots level would tolerate that, and there would be a tendency towards some much greater solidarity. And that's, I think, just having a concept of that, those nationalities and that ethnic solidarity, just with me having observed there, I think that there's plenty of people that are, very knowledgeable folks at that time would have seen, hey, this is a very useful thing to keep that really these regions marginalized. Just have that, like you said, that stick in the mud right smack in the middle. Because if you look at it, like, what's the pole of power? It's like Syria and Egypt, number one, tied number one, at the time, the potentially most powerful Arab countries, and then which you got Iraq, I guess, could have been pretty powerful as well. They're way over. They're on the eastern extreme, and then you've got the North African countries, but they could be their own thing over in the West. I mean, you know what I mean? You got Egypt, Sudan. But if you look at it, like, it's an oddly shaped group of like long chain of countries across like a part of the world. But if you look at the core Arab countries and the Gulf countries being pretty marginal at the time, because they were pretty much like desert still. They were just starting to develop. If you look at like the center of, I guess, like population and politics, political power and economic power, I mean, Israel is right in the middle.
Yeah, no, totally. So I guess to get to the point of, part of the egregiousness, I mean, something I do want to bring up there, the egregiousness of the state of Israel, or, well, I guess that's mainly in the question, what they were drawing attention to. I mean, again, even within, and this is a point I wanted to bring up earlier, even within Jewishness, there are a lot of different types of Jews. I mean, and then there's a lot of different colors. Like there's black Jews, there's Arabic Jews, right? The Mizrahi Jews. You have Ethiopic Jews. You have Sephardic Jews, who, and then you have, like me, Ashkenazi Jews who look white, right? And admittedly, like those groups, even to this day, don't treat each other very well. I mean, this is, one of the most mind-blowing things for me. I don't know how this is possible, but there are Ashkenazi Jews who are white nationalists. That blows my mind. Like, I don't understand. Like, do they not hear what their buddies next door are saying? The Jews will not replace us, and here you are supporting them. Like, what the hell is this? And there is an ugly history, and Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, and other Jews, that where they make claims, hey, the Ashkenazi Jews, when we're even in the state of Israel, they treat us like shit, or they even use us in medical experiments, or they do this and they do that. And I think there's a lot of validity. I'm not going to say that I believe all of it, but there's a lot of validity to those claims. And there's a lot of evidence for a lot of those claims. And this is an important point to bring up, is like this idea that, oh, it's the Jews, or, oh, it's the state of Israel. Yeah, it might be the state of Israel, but, understand, like, the Jews aren't all sitting around going kumbaya with each other. Oftentimes it's very much the opposite. And it bothers me, that happens, because the world looks at Jews as somehow like this unified ethnic oddity, right? Which is another part of this too. I think if the egregiousness stands out, because one of the points I really wanted with everything I've been, a lot of what we've been talking about and what I've been talking about, one of the points I want to bring up is that, in many ways, and people can disagree with me if they want, and I'll listen, because I'm here for you. I got you. Okay. I like to think I'm a very reasonable person. But in many ways, I don't see where Israel is any worse than any other country. They're all equally horrible. Except for maybe Saudi Arabia, they're really bad. But we can disagree on that if we want. But anyway, but it's the egregiousness. The reason it seems extra egregious, I think, is more because of the oddity that is Israel, that are Jews, as in they don't just say, praise Jesus every Sunday or whatever it happens to be, that, the focus is on them more. But I see no reason, and in fact, I imagine there's tremendous evidence that France is doing just as bad a shit, on any given day. Or take your pick of the country. And I mean, the question asker, they did say, it's like they know the U.S. is doing terrible stuff all the time too. And yeah, but part of the reason that I don't think it stands out as much does come down to, again, does your average U.S. military person or your average U.S. action or whatever, like, it just falls into the noise of this weird thing called Western civilization that so many people seem to be a part of. Anything outside of that comes off as twice as odd and twice as horrible, in my opinion. And that's just as true as it is for Jews, for the state of Israel, as it is, I think, unfortunately, for, any nation that identifies strongly with Islam. And that's unfortunate, So, Penguin, you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, let me put a different view towards you. Sure. So I don't think that what the state of Israel has done in the past, like 70 or 80, whatever years, is comparable to what most countries have done in that period of time. I think, yes, the United States did shockingly horrible things, in greater scale and scope. But they did it in like the 1840s and 50s and 70s and such. And, norms change and the history marches on. And also, like, video cameras become a thing, and television and the internet becomes a thing. And also, like I said, global norms have changed quite drastically. Mm-hmm. There's the United Nations, there's like a concept of human rights and stuff like that. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration. That I don't think that the United States does things, with strong exception of like the Iraq War and stuff like that. Yeah, comparable to, but they did it at a different point in history. And I mean, it might be hypocritical, but that's just kind of like the reality.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my old saying goes, and of course you got to back up these things with evidence. My old saying goes, the only thing that scares me more than the United States domestic policy is their foreign policy. When you're double tapping, populations, I mean, the United States foreign policy is a global atrocity. That has caused, like people can say, well, there's massive revolution going on in Iran right now. And that's directly because of nonsense. And this maybe speaks to your point that, okay, yeah, the US took out the Shah however many decades ago, and that's what ultimately leads to a lot of these problems. But yeah, it's hard for me to point at one nation and say, oh yeah, well, this one isn't as bad as this one. This one isn't as bad as this one. Because eventually everything is only a matter of time before somebody's either shot or locked up. And what do you got, Sec?
Yeah, no, all states are bad. And I don't think, comparing which state is worse is often very silly to me. But I think part of it is kind of what Penguin said. It's like, and what I said at the beginning of this conversation is, it's stuff that the U.S. was doing 40 years ago, but or 50, 100 years ago, or whatever, or all the states were doing, or even South Africa in the 80s. But 40 years later in the 2020s, you know what I mean? So it's like there's something to this too, and I don't know how to explain this exactly, but so the U.S. can splatter like poor brown kids' body parts all over the sand, right? But Israel goes door to door, and it seems, and rips beat the shit out of young Palestinian kids, pull people out of fucking mosques, blows up a whole family because a kid threw a rock in a tank, whatever the thing, and that seems significantly worse to most people, not to me, but to most people than the U.S. blowing up a settlement in Iraq or Afghanistan. So I think it's the closeness. It's less like war and more like the U.S. turning dogs on and fire hoses on black folks in their own country. Does that make sense? Yeah,
no, I hear you. Okay, so I'll take that point in that you're seeing far more human on human violence as to where it's not drone on human violence, or it's not helicopter on human violence, right? And I can appreciate. I don't appreciate it, but I can appreciate your point. In that, that's fair. Penguin, what do you got?
Keep in mind that a lot of you talk about like maybe I'm not going to, you didn't use this exact word, but the barbarity of like American policy, and especially looking at like the Cold War period, basically. So 40s to the 90s to 1990 or whatever. Pretty bad. I think as libertarians, we have a unique tradition of really strongly opposing and leading the charge against opposing like that. Very formative to like modern libertarianism in America, I should say. And I think that's a really important part of like the narrative of like the foundation of like American libertarianism. But just looking at the issue, by and large, it was horrible, brutal global campaign of absolute cruelty and barbarity. But to be fair to that period of time, it was mostly done by proxies. It was mostly done by proxies, and people in the domestic sense, it's just your average everyday people. They look at that and they don't see the U.S. doing it. I mean, yes, the U.S. is training, death squads and rape squads in the School of the Americas, but that's all kind of a very nuanced point that most people don't know about. Sure. And in reality, and there might be Green Berets in the country, but there's not an official or strong, numerically large military presence in so-and-so countries. So, I mean, to be honest with you, again, those death squads were composed of natives of whatever country in pretty much all cases. I mean, actually, the communists would have a lot of cross-border stuff, but in a lot of the cases, the American enforcers of the brutal global, I guess, U.S., NATO, liberal right wing, whatever you'd call it, like global order.
Mhm.
It was mostly composed of natives, and so you see that on the news. If you do see footage or you see evidence of that, you're like, oh yeah, those barbaric Guatemalans. You don't really differentiate or say, well, where are those people on those tactics? Who's arming them, so on and so forth. So I don't think actually that people draw a parallel against the United States military doing these things, because by and large, other than like quote unquote advisors, the U.S. military wasn't doing those things for all of those decades. That I think a lot of the stuff you were alluding to actually occurred.
Sure. No, again, that's fair. And I can really get that. One thing I want to make, super clear. And I know I said it in the last episode too, but just to make it clear again, I mean, even if I were somebody, I'm an anarchist, but even if I did believe in, the existence of nation states, and also I do have spiritual tendencies within Judaism itself. I do consider myself a Kabbalist. Even within a Jewish religious practice, I think it's super clear. I mean, there's argument about it, but I think it's super clear that the state of Israel as it is should not exist. Like this should have never happened. It should have never even have been tried for. Everything about it is like it goes right against the Tanakh, right against Midrash. Like, I mean, it's and most in the United States, especially, most of the people who you would look at and, they have, they're the quote unquote, the funny hair, right? They'll have their telefine and everything. A lot of them are, or not all, but many of them are Hasidic Jews and, and the like, and they're in line with my, with my thinking. No, the state of Israel should not exist. So even the people that every day you see that you think are the most hardcore Jews out there, most of them likely don't agree with the existence of the state of Israel, as it stands. Like, it's meant to be something that is more given to them and that the populations of the earth want them to have. Well, as we can clearly see, most of the populations of the earth do not want that thing to exist as it is. And what's happening to the Palestinians is an atrocity, and that word is far from strong enough. But this is a really key point to understand that, again, I dare say, I would argue most Jews in the world do not support the existence of the state of Israel.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that they're not supposed to return to Israel until the Messiah comes, right? Isn't that the idea amongst that's like orthodoxy?
Yeah. So there's this idea of what's called the three oaths, and this gets pulled out of the book known as the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. And it's, well, I mean, for Jews, I think it's clear that it says these three oaths are oaths between the earth and God. And God is saying, okay, you can't go into the land of Israel like a wall, meaning you can't have a mass influx of Jews come into the land of Israel, which is exactly what happened. Also, you can't, let's see, there's also part of the three oaths. One of the oaths is actually an oath with the Gentiles, which is you can't be too hard on the people of Israel, on Jews effectively. But then the second one is that, God says you can't rebel against the nations of the world. And that is explicitly saying, and then you get commentators like Maimonides, many of the big names, not all, but many of the big names within Jewish history, within rabbinicism, I should say specifically, who would say that, well, since you can't rebel against nations of the world, you can't go to war to take over the land of Israel again. That's where it comes from. It has to be given to you. Or it comes during the Messianic age when, like the lost 10 tribes of Israel have to come back, or will come back and come into the land of Israel, eventually. But again, that also can't happen as a wall, right? It can't happen as this big influx. So, I mean, to me, the Midrash is very clear in what it's saying, that, again, Israel as it stands should not stand. It should not exist. And it's not even something that Jews should actively push for. It is something that they will be given, within their own religious context. And we could get into other areas with this, but Penguin, what do you got?
Yeah, I mean, I just think you can't discount the fact that, like, there was a lot of different ideas of Judaism. First of all, I guess you should just go back to the very simple point where, again, you say all that, but the initial Zionists were a secular nationalist movement.
Sure.
Like a lot of Jews are secular, and a lot of Jews are secular. It's also an ethnic identity as well. And, I think Herzl and a lot of his crowd were
Right.
secular and atheistic nationalists. And this comes around in a time when we got to point out this comes into one of those big those top periods of time that were big globally on ethnic nationalism, and that's where you see like all the Bosnians and Croatians and Serbians all getting their own countries, and I think Serbia was a kingdom historically, but like Bosnians and Croatians and Hungarians and all that stuff, all this was in the context of greater nationalisms throughout. It was one of those big periods of time of like really strong fervent ethnic nationalism where like minorities within empires and stuff were and so these are Ashkenazi Jews, these are European Jews, so they're within that, they're developing their own version of that kind of ideology. It's not happening in a vacuum. It's not happening just among Jews, or it has nothing to do with just among Jews. And it's not obviously religious, as you pointed out. And also, like, because people were thinking about, let's put the Jews over in Siberia or China or Madagascar or Uganda or whatever. Well, or South America somewhere, or I'd never heard of Arizona and Oregon, but who would have thought? I think it was such a long shot. I don't think anybody thought that the Palestine thing was going to happen. And I don't know how much outside support they got. Outside support, sure, but I don't know how much outside support they got. I mean, it was a chaotic part of like a period of global history, and I just I don't think it was even considered that this was going to happen without massive outside help. And there was outside help, but I don't think it was massive enough that people expected it to work. And it was almost by accident that it worked.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, that's what I was saying with Truman. Truman did, he didn't even want to recognize the state. It existed, but he's like, no, we don't recognize that. It wasn't until again, it came down to ultimately a personal favor, but he wasn't even going to see anybody to talk about the whole thing. So yeah, right. I don't think that the Palestinian option was really on the table for most people. And like we said earlier, originally the Zionists they didn't care if it was in Israel. They just wanted it somewhere. They were thinking East Africa originally. So,
well, do we want to keep going with this, or we want to switch on to something else? You guys got more on this, or what?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of good points came out. The complexity of the situation, and in understanding, again, what is the egregiousness, and what does that look like? I was glad we got to define that later on even more. So yeah, I mean, we've got a little time. What else do we got? Let's get into something weird, because this was too normal. I don't know.
I know it. No, we're talking like foreign policy and stuff. It's
right. What the hell is that? Yeah.
Well, man, we got about 15 minutes before you got to leave.
Sure.
I'm gonna give everybody a little teaser and give you a little sneak peek into our secret chat group here, and I'm gonna let Brian choose from this fucking crazy ass list I got here.
All right.
So we got libertarian movement history, the universe. We didn't get to
that. Oh, all right. Go ahead.
I think that'd take more than 15 minutes.
Oh yeah.
Universe is a hologram.
Oh, boy.
Algorithms are magic. Mind body duality. Sec is MK Ultra. Property, the nap, and pacifism. Metal, Nazis. Man, I really wanted to talk Nazis, but that's a long one too.
Yeah.
Property and Lockean norms specific. Hollow Earth and reptilians. Your choice, Brian.
Holy shit. You got 15 minutes. Let's go. Wow.
I think we could do the nap and pacifism in 15 minutes.
Yeah, you know what? Actually, that's the one that came to mind for me. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Let's rock it. Yeah.
Let's do it. All right. So I was listening to one of your user podcasts on the nap, and you were taking huge dumps on the nap being the non-aggression principle.
Right.
Now, you and I are both what some might call egoists, where we're fans of Max Stirner, and I don't think either of us think that morality is universal or natural, found in nature, or inherent to
Correct.
humans.
Yeah,
So-
morality does not exist, straight up.
Right, exactly. Sure. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't find certain social construct you find useful, but that's a conversation for a different time. Now, so you criticize the nap for a number of reasons. One being that it sort of presupposes a certain set of property arrangements. And to me, so I've had different perspectives on the nap. Where I kind of sit normally is for me, it's not like something that's natural or inherent or you find in logic or whatnot, right? And I don't think it necessarily has to be strictly in reference to sort of Lockean property norms either. But it seems like a decent rule of thumb. Like I seem to things seem to be much better when I don't aggress on other people.
Sure.
In my life. So for me, it's an entirely like a useful social construct that serves my self-interest. So I guess can you quickly reiterate your argument against the nap and like why I would think being a pacifist yourself, you would sort of like a concept of non-aggression or a principle.
Yeah. So you kind of hit at it. I do like a concept of non-aggression. What I don't like is it's one of those things where it's not the idea, it's the people. And I'm gonna say
Bingo.
And I'm gonna say some controversial things probably just to freak people out a little, maybe with this as well. But the problem being the people is there are people who set up rules so that they have an excuse to engage in their own tendencies, whatever those happen to be. I'm not, I'd love to judge them and just say they're psychopaths, but whatever, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And my experience, and maybe this is a nice lead into the next Into the Void where we could do the history of libertarianism. My experience with many libertarians, being a F-list libertarian myself. So, a lot of times these libertarians would even come to me. My experience is they fetishize someone breaking the nap. And that's where my problem ultimately comes in, is they don't like the nap because they think it's a good idea. They like the nap because it gives them an excuse to be the hero or to hurt somebody because they've been hurt. And I can empathize with that part of it. But, it gives them legitimacy. It gives them a hard and fast rule for them to enjoy carrying around their AR-15. And that's a problem because we don't make rules so that we can, that allow us, even in breaking them, that allow us to, play out our fantasies. Okay. We come up with social constructs. We come up with, like agreed upon concepts, or if you want to use the term, rules, so that we have an idea of, what each other, how they'd like to be treated. But that's not my experience, why many libertarians anyway embraced the concept of the nap. They embraced it because they couldn't wait for someone to break it, not because they wanted everybody to respect it. And that's why I say that it's not necessarily the idea, it's the people. And Zach, do you have something to say to that?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I've seen that quite often, and my only other problem with it, and it probably comes from the same type of people, but they treat it like it's the word of God.
Yeah.
Like they have deified
Yes.
what's basically a decent principle when it's nothing. It came from human minds. It might be a good idea, but it's still just an idea that humans came up with. It's not written in stone or in the stars or anything of the sort. So I think the same people that sort of fetishize shooting people that step on their lawn are the same people that treat it like it's the gospel. And I have a problem with
not
both of
just
those.
libertarians.
What's that?
That's not just libertarians. Yeah.
That's not just libertarians. There's also other people that are not libertarians that again, you step on my lawn, I can pull out my shotgun. And
Totally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that just speaks to the origin of where a lot of this, like where does this fetishization even come from? Where does this embracing of this concept come from? It comes from, from I don't like to use the word trauma, but for the sake of the brevity in the argument, it comes from a lot of past traumas, quite frankly. They've been hurt and now they can't wait to hurt somebody else. In turn, it's their time. They get to be the hero now.
So I think that,
go ahead.
So like I was mentioning, because look, last topic, we're talking about, I briefly mentioned the context of like Zionism coming out of like a global, a period of time in global history where like nationalism is becoming a very popular thing throughout. You're in a stew of that. So likewise, when I look at any sort of kind of set of ideas or ideology or anything, I kind of look at it in its context. Like what were the people at the time experiencing and thinking of? And I think libertarianism, I've become much more comfortable with the idea, and I don't think I'm like this straight hardcore, completely unshakingly dogmatic libertarian by any means. I think, the world's a complicated place, but I'm much more comfortable with the idea of a market friendly and property centric libertarianism as an idea for like human liberation. And that sounds so backwards to so many people, because it's very much the reason that I think Rothbard came up with this and called it anarchism or anarcho-capital, kind of called it anarchism, used the word capitalism, used the word anarchism, used the word libertarianism, took it from the French anarchist or whatever. The whole point of that was to offer a different vision coming out of like Austrian liberalism or whatever, to come up with a different, Mises and all that stuff, is to come up with a different idea of human liberation that goes against the grain of what by this point was an established kind of orthodoxy of basically like property abolition and abolition of money and markets and stuff, and the collectivization of property and stuff. That this is required for human liberation. This is required to be considered a radical. This is what like radicals overall, I think by this point radicalism had kind of coalesced to mostly this kind of people. Whereas in the 19th century, there was a huge diversity of thought. But by the point, things became, the left and radicals had kind of whittled down to a more communist, I think, kind of focused thing. I mean, slowly over time.
Yeah.
And I think but it's coming out of an idea of like human flourishing and prosperity and liberation that has, I think, a strong basis in like Austro-libertarianism and liberalism and Mises and stuff like that. And I haven't read all this stuff. I'm not an expert, but it's generally trying to put forth like human prosperity and these, a type of, not egalitarianism, but a type of equality compared to, status structures, and a type of human liberation coming out of property that's kind of at odds with like property abolitionist liberation. And I think that it's not meant to be this kind of thing that like, I have all this property and you can't step on it, and if you do, I get to blast you away with my my privately owned nukes or whatever. Like that's not the point. And I think when you so misapply and misunderstand the whole like line of thinking behind the ethos, you can kind of twist it into something just kind of so far away from what it's meant to be in reality.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I think, another part of this is, and this will come full circle to what you're saying, Penguin. I think part of the well, I don't want to get stuck on like a language thing, because I think a nitpick I have with it is that it's almost, even though it says non-aggression, it's almost subtly telling you aggression, and it's making you think about that. And I'm going to turn that around, but I want to take a little route to get there. Okay. So if it was 100,000 years ago, forget about, concepts of technology, things like that. Like, don't put that into the equation. But if it's, so let's say 100,000 years ago, or even, 100 million years ago, whatever, whenever Homo sapiens decided to come around, okay, the non-aggression principle ultimately really doesn't mean much to them. Why? Because they're nomads and they move and they graze and they go to the left and they go to, they move to the left, they move to the right, and nobody really cares because there's so much abundance of resources around them in comparison to the amount of humans that there are to take advantage of it, that you generally don't run into a problem, or at least that would kind of be the assumption. And so the that's an easy, I might not be doing the best job of explaining it, but that's an easy way of explaining, well, look, the non-aggression principle doesn't exist because if you only had so many amounts of people, doesn't matter what time frame it's in. If you only had so many amounts of people, there's no real need for it, right? Because you can just have the lake over here and the other person can have the lake over there, and it doesn't really matter. But that's ultimately what it speaks to, is the issue of abundance, or the issue of anti-scarcity. And so kind of my problem, while in one sense, because Sek was, I think, right in pointing out that it would seem at the heart of the non-aggression principle, it's about respect. And so it's ultimately about not engaging in violence, not having to engage in violence. And so it could be seen as almost pacifistic if you went that far. But the problem within it is it's not really addressing the issue. It's basically saying, okay, this is mine, don't touch it. It's not talking about what you were bringing up, Penguin, which is, it's about generating human flourishing, about humanity evolving and growing and all that stuff. You ask most people about the non-aggression principle, and I bet that's not going to be what they think it's about, that's the underlying concept. But really it should be, right? So what it should what it should be is not the non-aggression principle. If we were to coin another term, it should be the pro-abundance principle. And that then speaks to what this is really about. It's not about shooting somebody for stepping on your lawn. It's about ensuring that in the future, there's a lawn to be had. There's a lawn that people could enjoy, and that maybe everybody could have a fucking lawn someday, because we could go to the stars and who knows land on what planet. I don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly what I was trying to say. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, but then the non-aggression principle, again, and I would say right from the get-go of the term, creates the antithesis effect in people's minds, the antithesis explanation, the antithesis route, the antithesis path that you're describing beautifully, Penguin. It doesn't go that direction. Instead, it really just creates a more of a warlike mindset, in my opinion, that it's about, you can't touch my shit, instead of we can all have shit, and that is a massive issue. And again, when we would say that the non-aggression principle is supposed to be about respect and respecting other people, well, the ultimate way to respect another person is to fucking let them live. And that's where my pacifism, comes in.
Yeah, I think that my, increasing comfort, I don't want to say embrace, but like my increasing comfort with the idea of like anarcho-capitalism and property is just based on the fact that I think it's just widely misunderstood and misapplied. I just think that it comes out of a very different place than the place that a lot of the adherents, and maybe it's because there's a filter effect with like the terminology and stuff. And maybe because, like you said, maybe there's a fundamental flaw with how it was presented and how things are named. And I think that's probably pretty close to true. I mean, it's certainly part of the cause here is that because there's lots of people wouldn't come to the same maybe bad conclusions or less than ideal conclusions independently if that weren't the case. So I think, I'm cool with the concept, but it requires a better understanding of liberalism and the backgrounds of these people and what the history of property and stuff like that, and what it's like to and not have the rule of law and what the rule of law means in an anarchist or a libertarian context. Like, that's higher level stuff than just get off my lawn,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Brian, we got to let you go. I know you got a hard stop, and
appreciate it, man.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on again. And it was very, very well said. I appreciate you sort of expanding on that, on the nap there and your argument for that. But I pretty much agree with you. So I think you're correct.
I'm sure in the next episode, we need to earmark the next episode for being the history of the libertarian movement online or in general. And this will come up again, guaranteed. And so if we have other points we want to get out, I'm sure we can make them
for sure. And audience, I promise we'll get way weirder next time. You heard the list.
Yeah.
We got plenty coming at you. It'll be way weirder than this. Who knows? Brian might get into Kabbalah. We should throw that on the list too. But yeah, thanks for coming on, dude. Your perspective is always, I always get a ton out of it. So I appreciate you coming on again. And everybody, like I said, everybody listening, we're going to get weirder next time. I'm going to schedule the next void after me and Brian get off of here. And then we'll get super weird. But everybody be excellent to each other. Brian, you want to plug some stuff? I know you got a bunch of shit going on.
Sure thing. I will just say quickly, I really appreciate, because we all have, I think we have, at least in certain ways, 3 different, at least angles we're coming from. I don't want to necessarily say perspectives because I think we agree on a lot, but 3 different angles that we come from. And I think it presents a lot. It's just great to talk to 2 brilliant guys like you about this stuff. Even when it's the things that aren't so weird, but I do love getting into the weird and I can't wait to do that. But if you want to get some other wackiness from me, of course, just head over to sovryntech.com. It's SOVRYN tech.com, or you could go to the really short version of the URL, which is nwo.red, which that'll just freak everybody out right now. So it's the perfect.
I'm telling you, he's a Jewish lizard. I'm telling you, I've seen it. I
love
it. Thanks again, brother. Always a pleasure. Penguin, you got anything else real quick? Penguin? No?
Sorry about that. No, I don't have anything. But thanks, Brian, for coming on. That was a great episode. I talked a lot in this one, and I learned a lot, actually. In between talking, I definitely learned a lot about the state of Israel and a lot of, that was good. And I think we put out some narratives there that I had I think this episode kind of pieced together a lot of little thoughts I've had on my own and kind of put them into a better narrative. Like, I've definitely learned a lot and I can definitely present those like disjointed ideas a lot better. So I can't wait to talk about the history of the libertarian movement, because basically there's this stuff that you're not going to know if you weren't there, and I wasn't there for all that, but I'm very interested to know.
It'll be a good time. Thanks, brothers. Appreciate it.
All right. Peace, brother.